In the shadows of Kensington Palace, where secrets are currency and truth is a dangerous weapon, one hidden letter would shatter the carefully constructed lies of the monarchy and expose a deception so profound that it would threaten to bring down the crown itself. The autumn rain drummed against the tall windows of Kensington Palace as Thomas Hartwell adjusted his crisp uniform and began his midnight rounds. For 15 years he had walked these corridors, his footsteps echoing through the marble halls where history lived and breathed in every portrait, every tapestry, every whispered conversation that these walls had witnessed. Thomas was more than just a palace guard. He was a keeper of secrets, a silent observer of the royal family's most intimate moments. Tonight felt different. The air itself seemed charged with tension, as if the very stones of the palace were holding their breath. Thomas had noticed the increased activity over the past few weeks, private meetings that ran late into the night, hushed phone conversations that stopped abruptly when he entered a room, and most telling of all, the strain etched across Queen Consort Isabella's usually composed features. Isabella Ravenscroft had married into the royal family 10 years ago, bringing with her a grace and dignity that had won over both the public and the press. Her marriage to King Edward had been hailed as a love story for the ages, a second chance at happiness for a monarch who had endured a very public and painful divorce from his first wife. The nation had embraced Isabella, seeing in her the stability and warmth that the monarchy desperately needed. But Thomas had seen beyond the carefully orchestrated public image. In the quiet moments between official duties, he had observed the subtle cracks in Isabella's facade, the way her smile would falter when she thought no one was looking, the tension in her shoulders during family gatherings, and most recently, the fear that flickered in her eyes whenever Prince William's name was mentioned. Prince William Ravenscroft, heir to the throne and Isabella's stepson, had always maintained a cordial but distant relationship with his stepmother. At 32, he was everything a future king should be: intelligent, charismatic, and deeply committed to his royal duties. The public adored him, seeing in him the perfect blend of his father's dignity and his late mother's compassion. But Thomas had noticed something that others missed: the way William's jaw would tighten when Isabella entered a room, the careful way he chose his words around her, as if he were walking through a minefield. The guard's rounds took him past the Queen Consort's private study, a room that had become her sanctuary within the palace. Through the partially opened door, Thomas could see Isabella seated at her antique writing desk, her auburn hair falling like a curtain around her face as she bent over what appeared to be a letter. The lamplight cast long shadows across the room, creating an almost theatrical atmosphere that seemed fitting for the drama that Thomas sensed was unfolding within these walls. As he passed, Thomas caught a glimpse of Isabella's face in profile. She looked older somehow, as if the weight of whatever secret she carried had aged her years in the span of weeks. Her usually steady hands trembled slightly as she held what appeared to be a piece of aged parchment, and Thomas could see the glisten of tears on her cheeks. Isabella had been reading the same letter for the third time that evening. The paper felt fragile in her hands, as if it might crumble at any moment, taking with it the last remnants of the life she had carefully constructed. The letter was dated 15 years ago, written in the elegant script of Lady Margaret Ashworth, Prince William's late mother and King Edward's first wife. Lady Margaret had died in a tragic car accident when William was 17, a loss that had devastated both the royal family and the nation. Her death had been ruled accidental, the result of a high-speed chase with paparazzi through the streets of London. But this letter, hidden away in a secret compartment of Margaret's jewellery box for over a decade, told a very different story. The letter was addressed to Margaret's closest friend, Victoria Sterling, a woman who had taken the secret to her grave just 6 months ago. It was only when Victoria's estate was being settled that the letter had surfaced, passed along by Victoria's lawyer to the person Margaret had specified should receive it in the event of both their deaths, Prince William. But the letter had never reached William. Instead, it had been intercepted by palace security and, following protocol, had been brought to Isabella as the Queen Consort. What she had read in those carefully penned lines had shaken her to her very core. In the letter, Margaret had detailed her growing suspicions about Isabella Ravenscroft, who at that time was working as a public relations consultant for the royal family. Margaret had noticed inconsistencies in Isabella's background, discrepancies in her stories about her past, and most damning of all, evidence that Isabella had been feeding information about the royal family's private affairs to certain members of the press. But the revelation that had stopped Isabella's heart was Margaret's discovery that Isabella had been having an affair with King Edward even before Margaret's death. The letter described how Margaret had hired a private investigator who had documented secret meetings between Isabella and Edward, gifts exchanged in private, and intimate conversations that left no doubt about the nature of their relationship. The most devastating part of Margaret's letter was her plan to confront Edward with this evidence and to expose Isabella's true nature to both her husband and the world. The letter was dated just 2 days before Margaret's fatal car accident. Isabella set the letter down with shaking hands and walked to the window, gazing out at the London skyline that sparkled like scattered diamonds in the darkness. She had spent 10 years building a life based on a foundation of lies, 10 years playing the role of the devoted stepmother and loving wife, all while knowing that her very presence in the palace was built on deception and possibly something far worse. The affair with Edward had begun innocently enough. She had been assigned to help manage the royal family's public image during a particularly difficult period, and Edward had been vulnerable, lonely in his marriage to a woman who had become increasingly distant and critical. What had started as professional sympathy had evolved into something deeper, and by the time Margaret had begun to suspect, Isabella was already too deeply involved to extricate herself. But Margaret's death had changed everything. Suddenly, Isabella was no longer the other woman, but the potential salvation of a grieving monarch and his traumatized son. Edward had turned to her for comfort, and she had provided it, carefully nurturing his dependence on her, while slowly erasing any trace of her involvement in his first marriage's deterioration. The public had seen their romance as a beautiful love story, a widowed king finding happiness again with a woman who brought stability and grace to the monarchy. They had no idea that Isabella had been present in Edward's life long before Margaret's death, or that her influence had contributed to the very loneliness and isolation that had made Edward vulnerable to her manipulations. Now, 15 years later, the truth was finally surfacing. Isabella knew that if this letter ever reached Prince William, it would destroy not only her marriage and her position, but potentially bring down the entire monarchy. William was not just Edward's son, he was the future king, and his legitimacy depended on the public's faith in the royal family's integrity. The sound of footsteps in the corridor outside her study made Isabella's heart race. She quickly folded the letter and slipped it into the false bottom of her jewelry box, a hiding place she had discovered years ago and had used to conceal other evidence of her deception. The footsteps paused outside her door, and she held her breath, wondering if someone had been watching her, if someone suspected what she was hiding. But the footsteps moved on, and Isabella released a shaky breath. She knew she was living on borrowed time. Victoria's lawyer had made it clear that there might be other documents, other evidence that Margaret had hidden away. If those ever came to light, if William ever learned the truth about his mother's suspicions and the circumstances surrounding her death, Isabella knew that no amount of public affection or royal protocol would protect her. As she prepared for bed that night, Isabella caught sight of herself in the mirror. The woman looking back at her was a stranger, pale, haunted, with eyes that held the weight of terrible secrets. She had once been genuinely beautiful, with the kind of natural elegance that had made her perfect for the role of queen consort. But now she could see the toll that years of deception had taken on her features. She thought about Prince William, asleep somewhere in the palace, unaware that his stepmother was the woman his mother had died trying to expose. She thought about Edward, her husband, who had built their marriage on the ashes of his first wife's suspicions and fears. And she thought about the British public who had embraced her as their queen, never knowing that they were celebrating a woman who had helped destroy the very marriage they had once revered. Isabella Ravenscroft had spent 15 years living a lie, and now that lie was finally beginning to unravel. The letter hidden in her jewelry box was just the beginning. She could feel it in her bones, the way a storm watcher can sense approaching thunder even before the first clouds appear on the horizon. As she lay in bed that night, sleep eluding her despite her exhaustion, Isabella began to plan. She had not survived this long by being passive or naive. She had built her position through careful manipulation, strategic thinking, and, when necessary, ruthless action. If the truth was determined to surface, then she would have to ensure that when it did, she would be ready to control the narrative. But even as she plotted and schemed, Isabella couldn't shake the image of Prince William's face, couldn't forget the way he had looked at her during their last family dinner, with a distance that seemed to suggest he already knew more than he was letting on. The thought that Margaret's son might already be investigating his stepmother's past sent a chill through Isabella's body that no amount of royal comfort could warm. The palace settled into its nighttime quiet around her, but Isabella knew that sleep would not come easily. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities to maintain her facade, and new dangers as the truth continued its inexorable march toward the light. The silent proof of her deception was no longer safely buried in the past. It was alive, breathing, and waiting for the right moment to destroy everything she had worked so hard to build. 3 weeks had passed since Isabella had first read Margaret's letter, and the weight of its contents had transformed her from a confident queen consort into a woman constantly looking over her shoulder. Every conversation felt loaded with hidden meaning. Every glance from palace staff seemed suspicious, and most troubling of all, Prince William had begun requesting private meetings with various members of the household, meetings that Isabella was pointedly not invited to attend. Thomas Hartwell had noticed the change in the palace's atmosphere immediately. As someone who had spent years reading the subtle signs of royal tension, he could sense that something significant was brewing beneath the surface of the family's carefully maintained public facade. His midnight rounds had become exercises in careful observation, noting which lights stayed on late into the night, which doors remained closed during times when they were usually open, and which conversations stopped abruptly when he appeared. It was during one of these rounds that Thomas made a discovery that would change everything. He had been checking the locks on the Queen Consort's study when he noticed something unusual about Isabella's antique jewelry box. The piece had always sat on her dressing table, an ornate Victorian creation that had supposedly belonged to her grandmother. But tonight, in the dim light filtering through the curtains, Thomas noticed that one corner of the box was slightly raised, as if it hadn't been properly closed. As a guard who had sworn an oath to protect the royal family and their property, Thomas felt compelled to investigate. The box could have been tampered with by an intruder, or it might contain something valuable that wasn't properly secured. What he found, when he carefully lifted the false bottom, was a collection of documents that made his blood run cold. Along with Margaret's letter were photographs, images of Edward and Isabella together in intimate settings, dated months before Margaret's death. There were also copies of financial records, showing payments from several tabloid newspapers to an account registered under one of Isabella's aliases, payments that coincided with various private royal family stories that had appeared in the press over the years. But the most shocking discovery was a small tape recorder containing a conversation between Isabella and an unknown man, discussing the Margaret problem and how it might be resolved permanently. The date on the recording was just 1 week before Lady Margaret's fatal car accident. Thomas sat in stunned silence, the evidence spread before him on the floor of Isabella's study. As a loyal servant of the crown, he had always believed that his duty was to protect the royal family's privacy and security. But this evidence suggested that the very person he was supposed to protect might be responsible for the death of the prince's mother and the deception of the king himself. The guard's training told him to follow the proper chain of command, to report his findings to his superior, and let the palace's security apparatus handle the situation. But his conscience told him something different. This evidence belonged to Prince William. It was his mother's final gift to him, proof of the suspicions she had died trying to confirm. After hours of agonizing deliberation, Thomas made a decision that would violate every protocol he had sworn to uphold. He carefully photographed each document, copied the audio recording, and then replaced everything exactly as he had found it. The originals would remain where Isabella had hidden them, but copies would find their way to the person who deserved to know the truth. Meanwhile, Prince William was conducting his own investigation, driven by instincts he couldn't quite explain and fragments of memory that had been haunting him for weeks. Ever since Victoria Sterling's death, he had been experiencing vivid dreams about his mother's final days, dreams that felt less like products of his imagination and more like suppressed memories fighting their way to the surface. In these dreams, he saw his mother pacing her study late at night, making phone calls in hushed tones, meeting with people he didn't recognize. Most disturbing of all, he remembered overhearing a conversation between his parents just days before his mother's death. A heated argument in which Margaret had accused Edward of betraying their marriage and their family. At the time, William had been too young and too focused on his own teenage concerns to pay much attention to his parents' marital problems. But now, with the perspective of an adult and the growing certainty that something wasn't right about Isabella's place in their family, those suppressed memories were taking on new significance. William had begun his own quiet investigation, using his position and connections to access records and information that would normally be beyond the reach of even the most determined journalist. What he had discovered so far painted a picture of Isabella Ravenscroft that was very different from the woman the public knew and loved. Her background, which had always been presented as modest but respectable, was actually a carefully constructed fiction. The consulting firm she had supposedly worked for before joining the royal household had no record of her employment. The university degree she claimed to hold had never been awarded to anyone by that name. Even her family history, full of generations of loyal British subjects, appeared to have been entirely fabricated. But it was the timeline of her relationship with his father that troubled William the most. According to official records, Edward and Isabella had met for the first time 6 months after Margaret's death, at a charity gala where Isabella was representing a public relations firm. Their romance had supposedly begun several months later, developing slowly and respectfully in consideration of the royal family's period of mourning. However, William's investigation had uncovered evidence that Isabella had been present at royal events and private family gatherings much earlier than the official timeline suggested. A photographer's contact sheet from a state dinner 2 years before his mother's death showed Isabella in the background of several shots, dressed not as a guest but as staff. Her eyes fixed on Edward with an intensity that suggested far more than professional interest. Credit card records, obtained through channels that William preferred not to examine too closely, showed that Isabella had been staying at hotels near the royal residences on numerous occasions when she was supposedly living and working in Edinburgh. Phone records revealed lengthy late-night conversations between Isabella and an unlisted number that William's sources had traced to one of Edward's private lines. The picture that emerged was of a woman who had been circling the royal family like a predator, carefully positioning herself to take advantage of any weakness or opportunity that presented itself. Margaret's death had simply provided the perfect opening for Isabella to step out of the shadows and claim the prize she had been working toward for years. As William sat in his private study, surrounded by the evidence of Isabella's deception, he felt a mixture of rage and profound sadness that threatened to overwhelm him. The woman he had accepted as his stepmother, the woman his father had married in what the world believed was a beautiful love story, was actually a fraud who had been present in their lives during his parents' marriage, possibly contributing to its deterioration, and certainly taking advantage of its weakness. But even more troubling was the question of what role, if any, Isabella had played in his mother's death. The timing was too convenient, Margaret's suspicions too close to the truth, and Isabella's subsequent rise too perfectly orchestrated to be entirely coincidental. It was then that Thomas Hartwell requested a private meeting with the prince, a request that was unusual enough to catch William's attention immediately. Palace guards did not typically seek audiences with members of the royal family unless there was a security concern of the highest order. When the two men met in William's study, the guards' nervousness was immediately apparent. Thomas had served the royal family faithfully for 15 years, and William had never seen him anything less than completely composed and professional. Now, however, the man could barely meet the prince's eyes, his hands shaking slightly as he placed a sealed envelope on William's desk. "Your Highness," Thomas began, his voice hoarse with emotion, "I have discovered something that I believe belongs to you. It concerns your mother, and I fear that if I follow proper protocol, this information may never reach you." The envelope contained copies of everything Thomas had found in Isabella's jewelry box, along with a detailed account of how and where he had discovered it. As William read through the documents, his face went through a series of transformations: confusion, disbelief, rage, and finally, a cold determination that Thomas had never seen in the prince before. Margaret's letter was everything William had suspected, and more. Reading his mother's words, seeing her fears and suspicions laid out in her elegant handwriting, felt like receiving a message from beyond the grave. She had known, somehow she had known that Isabella was dangerous, that her presence in their family was based on deception and manipulation. The photographs were damning, showing beyond any doubt that Isabella and Edward's relationship had begun long before Margaret's death. But it was the audio recording that truly chilled William to the bone. Hearing Isabella's voice discussing his mother as a problem that needed to be resolved made it clear that Margaret's death might not have been the accident that everyone believed it to be. "Thomas," William said finally, his voice steady despite the turmoil he felt inside. "You have done something incredibly brave and incredibly dangerous. This evidence could destroy not just Isabella, but potentially the entire monarchy. Are you prepared for the consequences of what you've brought me?" The guard straightened his shoulders, and for a moment, the nervous man who had entered the study was replaced by the loyal soldier he had once been. "Your Highness, I swore an oath to protect this family, and that includes protecting you from those who would do you harm. If Lady Margaret's suspicions were correct, then the Queen Consort represents a threat to everything the monarchy stands for." William nodded slowly, understanding the magnitude of what Thomas had risked to bring him this information. A palace guard who violated protocol and accessed private royal property without authorization could face not only dismissal, but criminal charges. By bringing this evidence to William instead of following the proper chain of command, Thomas had essentially committed treason against the crown. But William also knew that if Thomas had followed protocol, these documents would likely have found their way back to Isabella or to palace officials who might have decided that protecting the monarchy's stability was more important than pursuing the truth about Margaret's death. "I need time to study this information and decide how to proceed," William told Thomas. "In the meantime, you must continue your duties as if nothing has happened." Can I trust you to remain silent about this until I determine the best course of action? Of course, Your Highness, Thomas replied, but I should warn you. I believe the Queen Consort suspects that someone has discovered her secrets. She has been behaving very strangely over the past few weeks, and I have noticed increased security around her private apartments. After Thomas left, William sat alone with the evidence of Isabella's betrayal spread across his desk. The documents painted a picture of a conspiracy so elaborate and so devastating that it threatened not just his family, but the very institution of the monarchy itself. If Isabella had indeed played a role in Margaret's death, then William's father had unknowingly married his first wife's killer. The British public, who had embraced Isabella as their queen, had been worshipping a woman who had built her position on lies, deception, and possibly murder. But William also understood that exposing Isabella would come at an enormous cost. The scandal would rock the monarchy to its foundations, potentially leading to calls for the abolition of the royal family altogether. His father, who genuinely loved Isabella and had built his second marriage on what he believed was a foundation of mutual affection and respect, would be devastated to learn that he had been manipulated and deceived for over a decade. As William contemplated his options, he realized that he was facing the same impossible choice that had confronted his mother 15 years ago. Margaret had possessed evidence of Isabella's deception and had been preparing to expose her when she died. Now William held even more damning proof, but he also held the future of the monarchy in his hands. The question was whether he had the courage to finish what his mother had started, knowing that the truth might destroy everything she had spent her life serving. The silent proof of Isabella's crimes was no longer silent. It was screaming for justice, demanding that the woman who had built her throne on lies and possibly blood finally face the consequences of her actions. But first, William needed to understand exactly how far Isabella's deception extended, and whether she was still actively working to protect her secrets. If she suspected that her carefully constructed world was beginning to crumble, there was no telling what lengths she might go to in order to preserve it. The game of cat and mouse that had begun 15 years ago with Margaret's investigation was about to enter its final phase, and William intended to ensure that this time the truth would not die with the person seeking it. The days following William's discovery of his mother's evidence passed in a tense game of deception, with both he and Isabella maintaining their public roles while privately maneuvering for position in a conflict that could destroy them both. William had decided to conduct his own investigation before confronting Isabella directly, knowing that he would have only one chance to expose her and that she must not be given any opportunity to destroy evidence or fabricate explanations. Using his position and influence, William quietly assembled a team of trusted allies outside the palace walls. Detective Inspector Sarah Collins, who had worked on several high-profile cases involving the royal family, agreed to conduct an unofficial investigation into the circumstances surrounding Margaret's death. Dr. James Morrison, a forensic accountant who had previously helped expose financial fraud in other aristocratic families, began tracing Isabella's financial history and connections. Most importantly, William reached out to Michael Sterling, Victoria's son, who had been handling his mother's estate. Michael revealed that his mother had left behind a detailed diary covering the final months of Margaret's life, and that Victoria had suspected for years that Margaret's death was not accidental. "My mother never got over Lady Margaret's death," Michael told William during a clandestine meeting in a private club far from the palace. "She always believed that Margaret had been killed to prevent her from exposing someone close to the royal family. When she learned about Isabella's relationship with your father, she became convinced that she was looking at your mother's killer." Victoria's diary, which Michael agreed to share with William, painted a chilling picture of Margaret's final weeks. According to Victoria's entries, Margaret had become increasingly paranoid and fearful as she gathered evidence against Isabella. She had started varying her routes when traveling, had changed her daily routines, and had even mentioned that she felt like she was being watched. Most disturbing of all were Victoria's notes about a conversation she'd had with Margaret just 2 days before the car accident. Margaret had told her friend that she planned to present her evidence to King Edward the following week, and that she had also prepared a complete dossier to be released to the press if anything happened to her before she could make her revelations public. But that dossier was never found, Michael explained to William. "After your mother's death, the police searched her private papers as part of their investigation, but they found nothing related to Isabella or any concerns about your parents' marriage. Someone had gotten to those documents before the authorities arrived." This revelation convinced William that his mother's death was indeed connected to her investigation of Isabella, and that Isabella had moved quickly after the accident to eliminate any evidence that might have exposed her. The thought that Isabella had been present in the palace during the chaos following his mother's death possibly searching through Margaret's belongings while the family grieved, filled William with a rage so intense that he had to excuse himself from the meeting to regain his composure. Meanwhile, Isabella was fighting her own battle against rising panic. She had noticed the subtle changes in William's behavior toward her, the way his conversations had become more formal, his smiles more strained. More troubling was her discovery that her jewelry box had been disturbed. The documents were still there, arranged exactly as she had left them, but there were tiny signs that someone with training in surveillance had accessed the compartment. Isabella's background was not as fabricated as William believed. While her public biography contained numerous falsehoods, she had indeed worked for British intelligence services in her 20s, specializing in deep cover operations and psychological manipulation. The skills she had learned in that shadowy world had served her well in penetrating the royal family's defenses and maintaining her deception for over a decade. Now those same skills told her that her position was under attack and that she needed to act quickly to neutralize the threat. Her first priority was to determine exactly what evidence existed against her and who had access to it. She began her own counter-investigation, using contacts from her intelligence days to monitor communications and track the movements of anyone who might pose a danger to her position. It was through these channels that Isabella learned about William's meetings with Detective Inspector Collins and his contact with Victoria Sterling's son. The knowledge that Margaret's friend had kept detailed records of those final weeks sent a chill through Isabella's heart. She had assumed that Victoria's silence over the years meant that the woman knew nothing dangerous, but now she realized that Victoria had simply been waiting for the right moment to reveal what she knew. Isabella also discovered that Thomas Hartwell had been making unusual requests for access to palace security footage and had been asking subtle questions about the protocols for handling sensitive documents found in royal quarters. The guard's sudden interest in security procedures related to potential threats from within the palace made it clear that he had found something significant and was trying to determine how to proceed. Faced with multiple threats closing in from different directions, Isabella made a decision that would have been familiar to anyone who knew about her intelligence background. Rather than wait passively for her enemies to gather enough evidence to destroy her, she would take preemptive action to eliminate the threats against her. Her first target was Thomas Hartwell. The guard represented the most immediate danger because he had physical access to the palace and could potentially gather additional evidence against her. More importantly, his obvious loyalty to Prince William made him unlikely to be turned or compromised. Isabella began by subtly questioning Thomas's superiors about his recent behavior, suggesting that she had noticed him acting strangely and expressing concern about his reliability. She mentioned that she had noticed him lingering outside her private apartments at unusual hours and that she was worried he might be experiencing personal problems that were affecting his judgment. The seed of doubt, planted carefully and nurtured with seeming reluctance to criticize a long-serving employee, began to grow in the minds of the security administrators. When Isabella followed up a few days later with a report that she had noticed Thomas accessing areas of the palace that were outside his normal patrol route, an internal investigation was quietly initiated. But Isabella's most dangerous move was her decision to directly confront the evidence that threatened her. She knew that as long as Margaret's letter and the other documents existed, she would never be safe. The materials in her jewelry box were copies, but she needed to ensure that no originals existed that could be used against her. Using her knowledge of palace security systems and her access as queen consort, Isabella began a systematic search of areas where Margaret might have hidden additional evidence. She started with Margaret's former study, which had been sealed after her death and only occasionally opened for cleaning. Working late at night when the palace was quiet, Isabella methodically searched through every book, every drawer, every potential hiding place. It was during one of these nocturnal searches that Isabella discovered Margaret's true masterstroke. Hidden behind a false panel in the wall of Margaret's study was a complete dossier containing not only copies of all the evidence Margaret had gathered, but also detailed instructions for exposing Isabella in the event of Margaret's death. The dossier included a letter to be opened by Prince William on his 30th birthday, revealing everything Margaret had discovered about Isabella's deception and her suspicions about Isabella's involvement in the deterioration of the royal marriage.
It also contained copies of all the photographs and financial records that Isabella thought she had successfully suppressed.
Most terrifying of all was Margaret's detailed account of the threats she had been receiving in the weeks before her death. Anonymous phone calls warning her to stop her investigation, break-ins at her private residences where nothing was stolen but personal papers were disturbed, and finally, direct threats against her family if she proceeded with her plans to expose Isabella. The dossier made it clear that Margaret had known she was in danger and had taken precautions to ensure that the truth would eventually come to light even if she was silenced. The fact that these materials had remained hidden for 15 years was simply a matter of timing. Margaret had not anticipated that her death would come so soon, before William reached the age when he was meant to receive her final message. Isabella realized with growing horror that this dossier represented a time bomb that had been ticking away in the palace walls for over a decade. If William discovered these materials, if he read his mother's detailed account of Isabella's deception and her fears about what Isabella might do to protect her secrets, there would be no explanation, no manipulation that could save Isabella's position. But Isabella also realized that she now had an opportunity to permanently eliminate the threat that Margaret's evidence represented. If she could destroy the dossier and discredit the people who had discovered the copies, she might be able to weather the current storm and continue her reign as queen consort. The decision to take such drastic action was not made lightly. Isabella understood that she was crossing a line from which there would be no return. But she had come too far and sacrificed too much to allow Margaret's ghost to destroy everything she had built. Her plan began with Thomas Hartwell. The guard's investigation into her activities made him too dangerous to ignore, and his loyalty to William made him impossible to buy or intimidate. Isabella arranged for evidence to be planted in Thomas's quarters, suggesting that he had been stealing from the royal family and selling information to tabloid journalists. The planted evidence was sophisticated and damning, including forged bank records showing payments from newspaper publishers and copies of private royal documents that only someone with Thomas's level of access could have obtained. When the evidence was discovered during the security review that Isabella had initiated, Thomas was immediately suspended and placed under arrest pending a full investigation. But Isabella's masterstroke was her manipulation of the evidence itself. She arranged for the original dossier in Margaret's study to be destroyed in what appeared to be an accidental electrical fire. The blaze was small and contained, affecting only a portion of the study, but it was sufficient to eliminate the materials that posed the greatest threat to Isabella's position. To the outside world, the fire appeared to be the result of faulty wiring in an older section of the palace. The damage was limited to some furniture and books, and no one was injured. The investigation into the cause was brief and perfunctory, concluding that the palace's aging electrical system had finally succumbed to the strain of modern demands. Only Isabella knew that the fire had been carefully planned and executed to destroy specific evidence, while appearing completely accidental. Her intelligence training had included instruction in methods of eliminating sensitive materials, and the techniques she had learned decades ago served her well in protecting the secrets she had killed to preserve. With Thomas Hartwell discredited and under arrest, and with Margaret's original dossier reduced to ashes, Isabella felt that she had successfully neutralized the immediate threats to her position. But she had underestimated both Prince William's determination and his resources. William had been carefully monitoring Isabella's activities through his network of allies outside the palace. When Thomas was arrested, William immediately understood that Isabella was moving to eliminate witnesses and evidence. The timing of the fire in Margaret's study only confirmed his suspicions that Isabella was systematically destroying anything that could be used to expose her. Rather than being intimidated by Isabella's aggressive tactics, William saw them as confirmation that everything his mother had suspected was true. An innocent woman would not need to frame palace guards or destroy evidence. Isabella's actions were those of someone with deadly secrets to protect, someone who would stop at nothing to preserve her position. The game between stepson and stepmother was escalating towards its final confrontation, and William knew that he was running out of time. If Isabella was willing to frame innocent employees and destroy historical evidence, there was no telling what she might do to protect herself from more serious threats. The battle for the truth about Margaret's death and Isabella's deception was entering its most dangerous phase, and William realized that he would need to take far greater risks if he hoped to expose the woman who had built her throne on lies and possibly blood. The silent proof was no longer silent, it was crying out for justice, and William intended to ensure that this time the truth would not be silenced by another convenient accident. The arrest of Thomas Hartwell had sent shockwaves through the palace staff, but none more so than William himself. Watching a loyal servant who had risked everything to bring him the truth being dragged away in handcuffs was a stark reminder of the lengths to which Isabella would go to protect her secrets. It also clarified for William that half measures and careful investigation would not be enough to expose someone with Isabella's ruthlessness and intelligence background. Working with Detective Inspector Collins and his other allies, William developed a plan that was both bold and dangerous. Rather than trying to accumulate evidence slowly and risk having it destroyed or his sources eliminated, he would force Isabella into a situation where she would have no choice but to reveal her true nature in front of witnesses who could not be discredited or intimidated. The opportunity came in the form of the annual Royal Foundation Gala, a high-profile charity event attended by hundreds of dignitaries, celebrities, and members of the international press. The event was scheduled to take place in 3 weeks, giving William just enough time to set his trap. His plan was elegantly simple in concept but complex in execution. During the gala, in front of an audience that included representatives from every major news organization in Britain, William would present a toast honoring his late mother's memory, but instead of the usual platitudes about Margaret's charitable work and public service, he would read excerpts from her final letter, the one that Isabella thought had been safely destroyed in the fire. What Isabella didn't know was that Margaret had been even more thorough in preserving her evidence than anyone had suspected. Victoria Sterling had not only kept Margaret's letter, but had also made multiple copies, storing them in bank safety deposit boxes in different cities, under assumed names. The complete dossier that Isabella had destroyed was just one of several identical sets that Margaret had prepared. Michael Sterling had revealed this information to William only after being convinced that the prince was serious about exposing Isabella and willing to accept the consequences. Victoria's paranoia about her friend's death had led her to preserve every piece of evidence in multiple secure locations, treating Margaret's investigation like the intelligence operation that it essentially was. But William's plan required more than just documentary evidence. Isabella was too clever to be undone by papers alone, no matter how damning they might be. She would simply claim that the documents were forgeries, that she was being framed by enemies of the monarchy, or that the evidence had been taken out of context. Instead, William needed Isabella to confess or to act in a way that would confirm her guilt beyond any doubt. This required creating a situation where she would feel cornered enough to abandon her careful facade but confident enough to believe she could still control the outcome. The key to the plan was Detective Inspector Collins, who had been conducting her own investigation into Margaret's death using the evidence that William had provided. Collins had discovered that the original police investigation had been surprisingly superficial, focusing on the paparazzi chase that had allegedly caused the accident while ignoring other potential causes. Working with forensic experts and traffic reconstruction specialists, Collins had determined that Margaret's car crash could not have been caused by the circumstances described in the official report. The angle of impact, the speed calculations, and the timing of events all pointed to a different scenario, one in which Margaret's car had been deliberately forced off the road by another vehicle. More importantly, Collins had uncovered evidence that the paparazzi photographers who were allegedly chasing Margaret had been hired not by tabloid newspapers, as everyone assumed, but by a private security firm with connections to British intelligence services. The same firm that had employed Isabella Ravenscroft in the years before her marriage to King Edward. Armed with this information, William arranged for Collins to request a formal meeting with the royal family to discuss new developments in the investigation of Lady Margaret's death. The meeting was scheduled for the morning before the Royal Foundation Gala, giving Isabella less than 24 hours to process the implications of the detective's findings. Isabella's intelligence training had taught her to recognize when an operation was collapsing and when tactical withdrawal was the only viable option. The news that the police were reopening their investigation into Margaret's death, combined with her growing certainty that William possessed evidence against her, made it clear that her position was no longer sustainable. But retreat was not in Isabella's nature, and she had too much invested in her current life to abandon it without a fight. Instead of fleeing or attempting to negotiate, she decided to make one final, desperate move to eliminate the threat against her. Isabella's plan was to stage her own assassination attempt, making it appear that enemies of the monarchy were trying to eliminate her because of her popularity with the British people. In the chaos that would follow such an attack, key witnesses like William and Detective Collins could be eliminated while appearing to be collateral damage from the same conspirators. The beauty of this plan, from Isabella's perspective, was that it would transform her from a suspect into a victim, generating a wave of public sympathy that would make any future accusations against her seem like unconscionable attacks on a woman who had already suffered enough. Isabella's former colleagues in the intelligence services had taught her that the best way to hide a murder was to commit it in the middle of a larger tragedy, where individual deaths would be lost in the overall chaos. The Royal Foundation Gala, with its hundreds of attendees and international media coverage, would provide the perfect cover for her final solution to the problem of inconvenient witnesses. But Isabella had underestimated both William's determination and his resources. The prince had been carefully monitoring Isabella's communications and activities through his own network of intelligence contacts, people who were loyal to the monarchy rather than to any individual member of the royal family. When Isabella began making inquiries about security arrangements for the gala and requesting changes to the usual protocols, William's allies immediately reported these activities. Her attempts to bring in additional security personnel, people who were actually former colleagues from her intelligence days, were quietly blocked by the palace's legitimate security forces. Most importantly, William had arranged for the entire gala to be recorded not just by the official media, but by multiple hidden cameras operated by Colin's team. Every conversation, every movement would be captured from multiple angles, making it impossible for Isabella to claim that any subsequent events had been misunderstood or taken out of context. The night of the Royal Foundation Gala arrived with an atmosphere of barely contained tension. Isabella appeared radiant in a stunning evening gown, playing her role as the beloved queen consort to perfection. But those who knew what to look for could see the strain in her eyes, the slight tremor in her hands as she greeted guests and posed for photographs. William, meanwhile, projected an aura of calm determination that reminded many observers of his late mother. He moved through the crowd with easy grace, charming donors and dignitaries, while carefully positioning himself for the confrontation that he knew was coming. The moment of truth came during the evening's formal program, when William rose to deliver his toast to Margaret's memory. The assembled crowd, expecting the usual gracious tribute to a beloved royal figure, settled into respectful attention as the future king approached the podium. Instead of the gentle remembrance they anticipated, William's words cut through the elegant atmosphere like a blade. He spoke of his mother's dedication to truth and justice, her willingness to sacrifice everything to protect the monarchy from those who would corrupt it from within. And then, as the audience began to realize that this was not a typical memorial speech, William began to read from Margaret's final letter. "My dearest William," he began, his voice carrying clearly through the stunned silence of the ballroom. "If you are reading this, then my worst fears have come to pass, and the woman who has been slowly destroying our family from within has succeeded in silencing me." The reaction was immediate and electric. Gasps echoed through the crowd as William continued reading his mother's words, describing Isabella's deception, her affair with Edward, and her systematic betrayal of everything the royal family represented. Isabella, seated at the head table just a few feet from the podium, felt her carefully constructed world collapsing around her. Every instinct screamed at her to flee, to disappear into the crowd and escape before the full implications of William's revelations became clear. But her intelligence training also told her that running would be an admission of guilt. Instead, she rose from her seat with what appeared to be dignified composure, her face a mask of shocked bewilderment that suggested she was as surprised by these accusations as everyone else. "William," she said, her voice carrying just enough hurt and confusion to seem genuine, "I don't understand what you're trying to accomplish with these fabrications. This isn't the way to honor your mother's memory." But William was prepared for Isabella's response. As she spoke, Detective Inspector Collins appeared at the edge of the ballroom, flanked by several uniformed officers. The sight of police presence at what should have been a charitable celebration sent a new wave of tension through the crowd. "Lady Isabella," Collins announced in a voice that carried throughout the room, "I need to speak with you regarding new evidence in the investigation of Lady Margaret's death 15 years ago. Evidence that suggests her death was not the accident that everyone believed it to be. This was the moment that Isabella's training had prepared her for, the moment when an operation was blown and decisive action was required. But it was also the moment when her carefully cultivated image of the gracious queen consort finally cracked. Instead of maintaining her pose of innocent bewilderment, Isabella's expression shifted into something cold and calculating that was completely at odds with the warm maternal figure the public knew and loved. For just an instant, the mask slipped completely, revealing the trained operative beneath the royal facade. "You have no idea what you're dealing with," Isabella said, her voice now carrying a hard edge that no one in the room had ever heard before. Margaret was a naive fool who didn't understand the complexities of the world she was living in. Just like all of you, the transformation was so complete and so sudden that it took several seconds for the audience to process what they were witnessing. The beloved queen consort had just admitted not only that she knew more about Margaret's death than she had ever revealed, but that she held the late princess in contempt. But Isabella wasn't finished. 15 years of carefully controlled rage and frustration poured out as she continued speaking, her voice rising with each word. "You think you understand what happened. You think reading a few letters makes you experts in affairs of state. Margaret was going to destroy everything. The monarchy, the family, the stability of the entire government. I saved all of you from her self-righteous crusade, and this is how you repay me? The admission was everything William had hoped for and more. In her anger and desperation, Isabella had confessed not just to deceiving the royal family, but to viewing Margaret's death as a necessary sacrifice for the greater good. Detective Collins moved forward with her officers, but Isabella was not finished revealing the depths of her deception. As the reality of her situation became clear, she seemed determined to ensure that everyone understood exactly what they had been living with for 15 years. You want to know about Margaret's accident? Isabella laughed, a sound that held no warmth or humor. There was nothing accidental about it. She was warned to stop her investigation, warned repeatedly, but she refused to listen. She chose to put her precious principles ahead of the monarchy's survival. The ballroom erupted in shocked gasps and horrified murmurs as Isabella continued her confession. She spoke of the intelligence operatives who had forced Margaret's car off the road, of the evidence that had been destroyed in the aftermath, of the careful manipulation that had brought her into Edward's arms and eventually onto the throne. I gave this country 15 years of stability, Isabella declared as Collins attempted to approach her. I gave Edward a marriage based on loyalty rather than Margaret's constant criticism and moral superiority. I protected the monarchy from scandal and weakness. It was then that King Edward himself entered the ballroom, drawn by the commotion and the reports from his security detail. The sight of his beloved wife ranting about his first wife's death while surrounded by police officers was perhaps the most devastating moment in a night full of revelations. Isabella, Edward said, his voice barely above a whisper, what have you done? The question seemed to break the last of Isabella's composure. Faced with the man she had manipulated and deceived for over a decade, she finally told the complete truth about their relationship and its foundation in lies and murder. I gave you everything you needed, she told Edward, her voice now filled with bitter resentment. I eliminated the wife who was making you miserable. I provided the stability your reign required, and I asked for nothing except the position that I had earned through years of careful work. The confession was complete, captured by multiple cameras and witnessed by hundreds of people, including representatives from every major news organization in the world. There would be no denying what had been said, no way to claim misunderstanding or misinterpretation. As Detective Collins placed Isabella under arrest for the murder of Lady Margaret and conspiracy to defraud the crown, the woman who had once seemed destined to be remembered as one of Britain's most beloved queens instead became the architect of the monarchy's greatest scandal. William stood at the podium, watching as the woman who had destroyed his mother and deceived his father was finally brought to justice. The silence that had protected Isabella's secrets for 15 years had finally been broken, and the truth had emerged in a way that no amount of manipulation or violence could suppress. The royal family would survive this scandal, though it would take years to rebuild the trust that Isabella's deception had shattered. Thomas Hartwell was immediately released and exonerated, his reputation restored and his loyalty to the crown vindicated. But perhaps most importantly, Lady Margaret's final gift to her son had finally been delivered. The silent proof of Isabella's crimes would be silent no more, and the truth that had been buried with Margaret was finally free to shine light into the darkness that had surrounded the royal family for far too long. As Isabella was led away in handcuffs, her carefully constructed image crumbling before the eyes of the world, William felt a sense of peace that had eluded him for 15 years. His mother's death had finally been avenged, and the monarchy she had died trying to protect was finally safe from the threat that had corrupted it from within. The silent proof had spoken at last, and its voice would echo through history as a reminder that truth, however long delayed, will always find a way to emerge from the shadows and claim its rightful place in the light.